Imagine a quiet afternoon, the kind where sunlight streams through a window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, and the gentle hum of a distant television set fills the silence. It's a scene of serene normalcy, yet beneath its placid surface, a current of profound, almost unbearable irony flows. This is not a tale of star-crossed lovers, nor of a chance encounter that blossoms into romance. No, this is something far more unsettling, a narrative woven from the very fabric of fate's cruelest jokes. We're about to delve into a story so astonishing, so deeply intertwined with the human condition's most fragile threads, that it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about family, identity, and the relentless, unpredictable currents of life itself. It began, as so many unforeseen dramas do, in the most unassuming of places, a nursing home. Not the kind of grand, opulent facility you might see in a brochure, but a modest, well-worn establishment, its halls echoing with the quiet rhythm of lives lived, and lives slowly fading. This was the Maplewood Senior Living Facility, nestled in a quiet, tree-lined suburb of Ohio, a place of routine and quiet contemplation, where days often blended into weeks, marked only by meal times and the occasional visit from a loved one. It was here, amidst the familiar scent of antiseptic and stale coffee, that a truth so bizarre, so heartbreakingly coincidental, began to unravel. Our story's central figures were two individuals, seemingly ordinary, yet carrying within them the weight of untold histories. There was Arthur Finch, a man in his late 70s, with a shock of thinning white hair, eyes that held a lifetime of quiet observation, and a gentle, almost melancholic smile. Arthur had been a resident of Maplewood for nearly 3 years, his days filled with crossword puzzles, the occasional game of checkers, and the solitary pleasure of watching the world go by from his window. He spoke little of his past, a quiet reticence that hinted at unaddressed sorrows, a life lived largely unburdened by close familial ties. He was a man who seemed content in his solitude, yet one sensed a profound loneliness beneath his placid exterior. His only known relative, a distant cousin, visited rarely, and their conversations were always brief, superficial, skirting the edges of any true intimacy. Arthur had moved to Ohio decades ago, a young man seeking a fresh start, leaving behind a childhood he rarely spoke of, a past shrouded in an almost deliberate amnesia. He carried with him only a few faded photographs, none of which he ever seemed to look at, as if the images held memories too painful to confront. Then there was Beatrice Holloway, a woman a few years Arthur's junior, perhaps in her mid-70s, with a vibrant spirit that defied her age and the limitations of her declining health. Beatrice was a force of nature, even in her frail state. Her silver hair, meticulously styled, framed a face etched with the lines of laughter and sorrow, her eyes sparkling with an irrepressible curiosity. She was the life of the common room, her stories of a bygone era captivating her fellow residents, her witty observations bringing smiles to even the most jaded faces. Beatrice, too, had a past that seemed to have been deliberately compartmentalized. She spoke fondly of a vibrant youth spent in a bustling East Coast city, of friendships and adventures, but rarely, if ever, of family. She had moved to Ohio later in life, drawn by the promise of a quieter existence, a fresh start after what she only vaguely referred to as a difficult period. Like Arthur, she seemed to have arrived at Maplewood without the comforting presence of immediate family, a fact that seemed to prickle at the edges of her otherwise ebullient personality. Her interactions with others were always warm and engaging, yet there was a subtle, almost imperceptible barrier, a guardedness around her deepest emotions. Their paths, though residing in the same facility, hadn't immediately converged in any significant way. They were polite acquaintances, sharing a nod in the dining hall, a brief exchange about the weather. It was the kind of gentle, unremarkable interaction common in such places, born of proximity rather than any deep connection. Until that one fateful Tuesday. It was during one of Maplewood's weekly memory lane sessions, a time set aside for residents to share stories and photos from their past. Beatrice, ever the animated storyteller, was recounting a childhood memory of a mischievous prank she and her older brother had pulled on their unsuspecting parents. She described with vivid detail the cramped apartment building, the smell of her mother's baking, the worn wooden stairs, and the distinct freckle pattern on her brother's left ear. She spoke of him with a mixture of fondness and regret, a deep longing for a connection long lost. "He was my protector," she murmured, her voice softening. "My anchor in a world that often felt too big and too loud." She paused, a wistful smile playing on her lips, her gaze unfocused, lost in the echoes of a distant past. Across the room, Arthur, who rarely participated in these sessions, was listening intently. Something in Beatrice's description, a fleeting detail, a particular turn of phrase, had pricked at a long-dormant corner of his memory. He felt a peculiar tightening in his chest, a sense of recognition he couldn't quite place. As Beatrice continued, her voice painting a picture of her childhood home, the pieces of a puzzle he didn't even realize he was solving began to click into place. The cramped apartment, the specific layout of the rooms, the old creaky radiator in the corner of the living room. It was all too familiar. And then she mentioned the name. "Thomas?" she whispered, a tear glistening in her eye. "My brother Thomas. He was always getting into trouble, but he had the kindest heart." The name hit Arthur like a physical blow. Thomas, his own given name, a name he had shed decades ago, along with the painful memories it carried. He had reinvented himself, meticulously crafting a new identity, a new life, far removed from the shadows of his youth. He had become Arthur, a man without a past, or so he thought. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the gentle hum of the television fading into an echoing silence in his ears. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of disbelief and dawning horror. He looked at Beatrice, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not just a fellow resident, but something infinitely more profound. The way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the subtle gesture she made with her hand when she was emphasizing a point, the faint scar above her left eyebrow. These were not just random observations. They were fragments of a forgotten tapestry, threads of a connection he had actively suppressed for a lifetime. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not a coincidence. This was an intervention of the cruelest kind, a cosmic joke played out in the quiet confines of a nursing home. The woman across the room, the vibrant storyteller, the one with the irrepressible spirit, was not just a stranger. She was, he realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach, his sister, his younger sister, Beatrice, whom he had last seen as a child, a tiny, freckle-faced girl with an infectious giggle. The memories, long buried beneath layers of denial and avoidance, began to surface, sharp and vivid, tearing at the carefully constructed facade of his solitary existence. The guilt, the abandonment, the desperate need to escape a life that had become unbearable. It all came rushing back, a tidal wave of suppressed emotion. He felt a tremor run through him, a cold dread creeping up his spine. The past, he discovered in that agonizing moment, was never truly gone. It simply waited patiently for the opportune moment to reclaim its hold. The quiet afternoon had transformed into a crucible, and two strangers were about to discover a truth that would shatter their carefully constructed realities, forcing them to confront a shared history they had both, for very different reasons, tried so desperately to forget. The stage was set for a revelation that would reverberate through the quiet halls of Maplewood, touching lives far beyond the two individuals at its center, forever altering the tranquil rhythm of their twilight years. The silence that followed Beatrice's story was not just a pause. It was the uneasy calm before a storm of forgotten memories, shattered identities, and the undeniable, often brutal power of blood. The revelation hung in the air, a silent, weighty presence, pressing down on Arthur with an almost suffocating force. He could feel the eyes of the other residents on him, curious, perhaps even a little concerned by his sudden stillness. But he saw none of them. His gaze was locked on Beatrice, who, oblivious to the storm brewing within him, had simply smiled softly and settled back into her chair, lost in her memories. How could he tell her? How could he possibly articulate the earth-shattering truth that had just crashed into his meticulously ordered world? The words felt foreign, heavy, impossible to form. He, Thomas, had vanished from her life decades ago, leaving behind a void, a question mark, a wound that clearly still ached. What right did he have to reappear now, a ghost from her past, to shatter the peace she had clearly found? The guilt, a familiar companion he had kept at arm's length for so long, now surged with overwhelming intensity. He remembered the day he left, a raw, desperate decision made by a terrified young man. Their home life had been far from ideal. A father consumed by alcohol, a mother worn thin by worry and relentless toil. Poverty was a constant, gnawing presence, and arguments were the soundtrack to their days. He, as the older brother, had felt the weight of responsibility crushing him, a burden too heavy for his young shoulders. He had loved Beatrice fiercely, a bright, fragile flame in the darkness of their lives. He remembered her small hand in his, her wide, trusting eyes looking up at him, her innocent belief that he could fix anything. But he couldn't. He couldn't fix the poverty, couldn't fix their parents' broken marriage, couldn't fix the gnawing sense of hopelessness that permeated their existence. One particularly brutal argument between his parents had been the breaking point. The sounds of their yelling, the clatter of a plate shattering against the wall, and Beatrice's frightened sobs from her small bedroom had etched themselves into his memory, a permanent scar. He had packed a small bag, a meager collection of clothes and a few stolen dollars, and slipped out in the dead of night, leaving a hastily scrawled note, a pathetic attempt at an explanation that he knew even then was utterly inadequate. He had told himself it was for the best, that he was freeing them from the burden of his presence, that he would eventually find his way and come back for her. A naive, desperate fantasy. He had hitchhiked west, taking odd jobs, always moving, always looking over his shoulder, a phantom of his former self. He had changed his name, first to Tom, then to Arthur, shedding each syllable as if it would erase the past, cleanse him of the guilt. He had built a new life, a quiet, solitary one, devoid of the complexities of family, believing he was protecting himself from pain, and them from the disappointment of his failure. Now, sitting across from her, seeing the vibrant woman she had become, the depth of his abandonment hit him with a force that stole his breath. She had clearly thrived, despite his absence. She had found a way to navigate life, to find joy, to build her own narrative. And here he was, an unwelcome intrusion, a reminder of a past she had perhaps, mercifully, come to terms with. The thought of shattering her carefully constructed peace, of opening old wounds, filled him with a profound sense of dread. What if she hated him? What if she wanted nothing to do with him? The fear of rejection, of confirming his deepest insecurity, that he was fundamentally unlovable, unworthy of connection, was almost paralyzing. But then, another emotion began to stir within him, a tender, fragile tendril of hope. The thought of reconnecting with his sister, the only true anchor to his forgotten youth, was intoxicating. To finally unburden himself, to explain, to apologize, to perhaps even find some measure of forgiveness. It was a terrifying prospect, yet the pull was undeniable. The loneliness he had so carefully cultivated now felt unbearable. He had spent a lifetime running from his past, and now, here it was, sitting right in front of him, a beacon of both pain and promise. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He knew he had to speak. The silence was becoming too heavy, too telling. His hand trembled slightly as he reached across the small table that separated them, a table often used for board games and afternoon tea. "Beatrice," he began, his voice raspy, barely a whisper. His voice, usually so steady, now sounded unfamiliar, strained. Beatrice looked up, her bright eyes meeting his. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "Yes, Arthur?" she asked, her voice clear and melodious, a stark contrast to his own gravelly tone. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. "The story you just told," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "about your brother, Thomas, and your childhood home." He trailed off, searching for the right words, for a way to bridge the chasm of decades and unspoken truths. The apartment, the radiator, the freckles on his ear. Beatrice's brow furrowed slightly, a hint of confusion in her eyes. "Yes?" she prompted, her voice softer now, sensing the unusual weight in his words. Arthur took another shaky breath. I remember it." The words were out, small, tentative, yet they felt like thunder in the quiet room. "I remember it all." He saw a subtle shift in her expression, a dawning realization, a faint tremble in her lower lip. Her eyes widened, searching his face, suddenly seeing him not as Arthur Finch, the quiet resident, but as something else, something profoundly significant. The lively chatter in the common room seemed to fade into a distant hum as their gazes locked, a silent conversation passing between them, filled with unspoken questions and the echoes of a shared past. The air crackled with unspoken possibility, with the immense weight of a life-altering revelation hanging precariously in the balance. It was as if time itself had paused, waiting for the inevitable, for the moment when two fragmented narratives would finally, irrevocably, intertwine. The past, long buried and meticulously avoided, was no longer a distant echo. It was here, now, in the quiet confines of Maplewood, ready to reclaim its hold and rewrite the twilight years of two unsuspecting souls. The journey of discovery had just begun, a journey into the heart of memory, identity, and the enduring, often painful, bonds of family. The silence that followed Arthur's hesitant confession was deafening, punctuated only by the distant murmur of the television and the gentle creak of a floorboard. Beatrice stared at him, her vibrant eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning recognition. Her usual vivacity seemed to drain from her, leaving her pale and momentarily speechless. The playful warmth that typically radiated from her vanished, replaced by a fragility that Arthur found both heartbreaking and terrifying. He watched as a kaleidoscope of emotions flickered across her face. Confusion, then a spark of understanding, followed by a profound sadness that seemed to well up from the deepest recesses of her being. You remember?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread in the sudden stillness of the room. Her gaze swept over his face, searching, dissecting, as if trying to reconcile the present Arthur with the ghost of her past. She saw the lines of age, the thinning hair, the weariness in his eyes, but beneath it all, a faint, undeniable echo of the boy she remembered. The way his brow furrowed when he was concentrating, the slight tilt of his head, even the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his hands. They were all familiar, buried deeply in her subconscious, now rising to the surface with chilling clarity. Arthur nodded slowly, his own throat tight with emotion. "Every detail," he confirmed, his voice still a rough whisper. "The tiny kitchen, the way the sunlight hit the old wooden table in the mornings, the squeak of your bedroom door, and your freckles, Beatrice. I remember your freckles." He forced a small, strained smile, a desperate attempt to bridge the immense chasm between them. A gasp escaped Beatrice's lips, a tiny, wounded sound. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. "Thomas?" she choked out, the name a raw, aching question. Is that really you, Thomas?" The decades of silence, the countless nights she had wondered, the quiet grief she had carried, it all coalesced into that single, desperate inquiry. Arthur, or rather, Thomas, felt a wave of profound relief wash over him, intertwined with an even greater surge of guilt. The name, spoken by her, felt both alien and intimately familiar, a lost piece of his own fragmented identity. "Yes," he affirmed, his voice cracking. "It's me, B. It's Thomas." He watched as a single tear traced a path down her cheek, followed by another, and then a torrent. She was weeping silently, tears of sorrow, of shock, of a long-suppressed grief finally finding its release. The other residents, who had been quietly observing the increasingly intense interaction, now exchanged nervous glances. Some looked away, respecting the raw intimacy of the moment, while others simply watched, their own faces etched with curiosity and perhaps a touch of empathy. The staff, usually adept at managing the subtle emotional currents of the nursing home, seemed momentarily unsure how to intervene in this deeply personal unfolding drama. Beatrice, oblivious to their surroundings, reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against Arthur's. Her touch was feather-light, tentative, as if testing the reality of the moment. I always wondered," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I never knew what happened to you. Mama and Papa. They never spoke of it. It was like you just vanished." The pain in her voice was palpable, a stark reminder of the void he had left behind. Arthur's heart ached. "I'm so sorry, Bea," he murmured, his voice laced with a profound regret that spanned decades. "I was a scared kid. I didn't know how to handle anything. I thought I was doing the right thing. I was so lost." The words poured out, unbidden, a confession he had held captive for a lifetime. He recounted his desperate flight, the years of struggling, the deliberate erasure of his past, the painstaking construction of his new identity. He spoke of the shame, the fear of failure, the inability to face the family he had abandoned. Beatrice listened, her tears still flowing, but her gaze never leaving his face. There was no anger in her eyes, only an overwhelming sense of pain and, perhaps, a glimmer of understanding. "We missed you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every day. Mama especially. She never recovered from losing you." The weight of those words, the knowledge of the suffering he had inadvertently caused, pressed down on Arthur, a crushing burden. He had always tried to rationalize his actions, to believe that his absence had caused less pain than his continued presence would have. But her words shattered that illusion. They sat there for a long time, two fractured souls slowly, tentatively, beginning to piece together the fragments of their shared history. The room around them faded into insignificance. It was just them, two siblings reunited by the cruelest of ironies in the most unexpected of settings. They spoke of their parents, of their childhood home, of the few treasured memories they both held. Beatrice shared stories of her life after he left, of her struggles, her triumphs, the quiet resilience that had allowed her to build a fulfilling life despite the unaddressed wound of his disappearance. Arthur, in turn, spoke of his solitary journey, the quiet moments of longing, the persistent shadow of regret that had followed him through the decades. It was a conversation steeped in sorrow, yet beneath the grief, a fragile seed of hope began to sprout. The initial shock began to subside, replaced by a dawning sense of connection, a profound relief that the question mark of their past had finally found an answer, however painful. The bond of blood, long severed by circumstance and fear, was slowly, hesitantly, beginning to mend. It was not a joyous reunion in the traditional sense, but a cathartic unraveling of decades of unspoken pain, a shared acknowledgement of a history that had shaped them both in profound, undeniable ways. They had met in a nursing home, not as strangers, but as ghosts of each other's pasts, brought together by a twist of fate so extraordinary, so unbelievably poignant, that it defied all logic. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the echoes of other lives, they began the arduous, yet ultimately necessary, work of reconciliation, a journey into the uncharted territory of rediscovered family. The first step had been taken, a tentative bridge built across the vast expanse of time and separation, leading them towards a future intertwined with the threads of their newly unearthed shared past. The initial shock and raw emotion of their reunion slowly began to settle into a fragile, almost tentative peace. Days turned into weeks, and Arthur and Beatrice, now inextricably linked by their shared past, found themselves spending countless hours together. They would sit in the sun-drenched common room, or in the quiet privacy of Beatrice's room, recounting stories, piecing together the fragmented narrative of their lives. Each anecdote, each rediscovered memory, was a thread in the tapestry of their long-lost connection, weaving together a history that had been brutally torn apart decades ago. Beatrice, with her vibrant memory and natural storytelling ability, filled in the blanks of Arthur's past, describing the impact of his disappearance on their parents, particularly their mother. Arthur listened, his heart heavy with regret, as she painted a picture of a woman who had carried the burden of his absence until her dying day. He learned that their father, in his grief and resentment, had rarely spoken of him, effectively erasing him from the family narrative. This knowledge was a bitter pill, confirming his deepest fears about the consequences of his actions, yet also offering a strange sense of closure. He was no longer a ghost in their history. He was a painful yet undeniable part of it. In turn, Arthur, slowly shedding the layers of his carefully constructed persona, began to share the story of his solitary journey. He spoke of the loneliness, the constant fear of being discovered, the years of hard labor and transient living. He confessed the profound emptiness he had felt, despite his material successes, a void that no amount of travel or reinvention could fill. He admitted that the quiet solitude he had cultivated was not a choice, but a defense mechanism, a way to avoid the very pain and vulnerability he was now confronting. Beatrice listened with a compassionate understanding that surprised him. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a deep, empathetic sadness for the paths they had both been forced to walk. She understood the desperation that could drive a person to such drastic measures, even if she couldn't fully comprehend the extent of his fear. Their conversations were not always easy. There were moments of awkward silence, of lingering resentment, of raw, unaddressed pain. Arthur often struggled to articulate the depth of his regret, his words feeling inadequate to convey the lifetime of guilt he carried. Beatrice, too, grappled with the complex emotions of finding her lost brother, a man who was both a stranger and the most intimate connection to her earliest memories. She had carried the weight of his absence for so long, and now, his presence, though a miracle, also brought with it a cascade of unprocessed grief. One afternoon, while sifting through a box of old photographs that Beatrice had kept, a small, faded picture slipped from her grasp. It was a black-and-white snapshot of a young boy and a little girl, their faces bright with innocent joy, standing in front of a slightly dilapidated house. The boy, with his mischievous grin and distinct freckles, was undeniably Thomas. The little girl, with her wide, curious eyes and bright smile, was Beatrice. Arthur picked it up, his hand trembling. "This was taken the summer before everything," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Beatrice nodded, her gaze fixed on the photograph. "Our last summer," she whispered. "I kept it hidden, even from Mama. It was my secret hope that you'd come back." Her words, simple yet profound, brought a fresh wave of tears to Arthur's eyes. The unspoken bond, the enduring hope, had spanned decades, transcending the distance and the silence. Their reunion became a quiet sensation within Maplewood. The staff, initially discreet, now watched with a sense of awe and gentle respect as the two siblings slowly navigated their newfound relationship. Other residents, having heard whispers of their astonishing story, would offer quiet smiles and words of encouragement. It was a testament to the enduring power of family, even in the twilight years, even after decades of separation. As weeks turned into months, Arthur and Beatrice began to forge a new kind of bond, one built on the fragile foundation of rediscovered trust and the shared understanding of a painful past. They were no longer just residents of a nursing home. They were brother and sister, finally given the chance to mend a broken history. They found comfort in each other's presence, a quiet companionship that filled the voids they had both carried for so long. They would talk for hours, not just about the past, but about the present, sharing their thoughts on the mundane details of nursing home life, their opinions on the news, their hopes for the limited time they had left. The story, however, was not without its lingering shadows. The years of separation, the unaddressed pain, had left scars that would never fully heal. Arthur would always carry the weight of his abandonment, and Beatrice would always bear the memory of her lost brother. But in their shared vulnerability, they found a strange kind of strength. They were no longer alone in their individual histories. They were two pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their way back together. The revelation had been shocking, devastating, but ultimately, it had opened the door to a profound healing, a chance to finally close the chapter on a past that had haunted them both. Their future, though limited by time and circumstance, was now intertwined, bound by the undeniable, unbreakable threads of family. The quiet halls of Maplewood, once a place of solitary contemplation, had become the unlikely stage for a poignant tale of loss, discovery, and the enduring power of human connection. This extraordinary journey, from strangers to siblings, had been a testament to fate's unpredictable turns and the human heart's remarkable capacity for resilience and forgiveness. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but a raw, honest portrayal of two lives irrevocably altered by a single, astonishing revelation, finding solace and redemption in the quiet twilight of their lives. The quiet rhythm of life at Maplewood Senior Living had transformed for Arthur and Beatrice. No longer isolated individuals navigating their own twilight years, they were now a unit, two halves of a long-separated whole. Their days were filled with a gentle, comforting routine of shared meals, long conversations, and the quiet joy of simply being in each other's presence. The initial intensity of their reunion had mellowed into a deep, abiding affection, a silent understanding that transcended words. They were making up for lost time, not with a frantic energy, but with a deliberate, appreciative slowness, savoring each moment of their rediscovered connection. Beatrice, ever the more outgoing of the two, found immense comfort in Arthur's quiet strength. She no longer had to carry the untold stories of her childhood alone. There was now someone who not only understood, but had lived a part of it alongside her. She delighted in sharing small, mundane details of her day with him, and he, in turn, listened with an attentiveness he had rarely shown to anyone else in his solitary life. He found himself opening up in ways he never thought possible, sharing his deepest fears and regrets, and receiving not judgment, but empathy and a profound sense of acceptance. The weight he had carried for decades, the self-imposed isolation, slowly began to lift. They spoke often of the what-ifs. What if he hadn't left? What if she had sought him out? What if their parents had spoken of him? These hypotheticals were no longer sources of pain, but rather reflections on the unpredictable nature of life, the myriad paths that one's journey could take. They found solace in the understanding that, despite the decades of separation and the pain it had caused, fate had, in its own enigmatic way, brought them back together. It was a testament to the enduring, almost mystical pull of family bonds. As the months passed, their physical health, though still a concern in the context of their age, seemed buoyed by their renewed connection. There was a lightness in Beatrice's step, a brighter sparkle in her eyes. Arthur, too, seemed to stand a little taller, his smile more frequent and genuine. The staff at Maplewood often remarked on the transformation, a quiet miracle unfolding within their walls. They had witnessed countless residents come and go, but few stories resonated with such profound human drama and eventual, poignant triumph. Their story, however, was not destined to last indefinitely. Time, in its relentless march, acknowledges no exceptions. One crisp autumn morning, Beatrice woke feeling unusually weak, a profound fatigue settling deep in her bones. Arthur was by her side immediately, his hand gently clasped in hers. He knew, with a heavy heart, that this was the beginning of the end. He had seen it before in the nursing home, the subtle shift, the quiet resignation as life slowly prepared to slip away. He stayed with her, day and night, reading to her from her favorite books, holding her hand, reminiscing about their childhood, their voices soft, almost a lullaby. They spoke of the future, not with grand plans, but with a quiet acceptance of what was to come. Beatrice, ever pragmatic, even in her final hours, smiled faintly. "At least," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "at least we found each other again, Thomas. That's all that matters." Her words were a balm to his soul, a final, precious gift of forgiveness and love. Beatrice passed peacefully in her sleep a few days later, her hand still resting gently in Arthur's. The quiet room, once filled with their shared stories and laughter, was now steeped in a profound, yet strangely peaceful silence. Arthur felt the familiar ache of loss, but this time, it was different. It was not the isolating, unaddressed pain of his youth, but a grief mingled with gratitude, with the quiet satisfaction of a bond finally mended, a history finally reconciled. He had lost his sister, but he had also found her, and in doing so, he had found a part of himself he had believed was forever lost. His remaining time at Maplewood was marked by a quiet reflection. He continued his routine, but now, when he sat by the window, he didn't just watch the world. He remembered Beatrice, her vibrant spirit, her infectious laughter, the comfort of her presence. He carried her memory not as a burden of regret, but as a cherished testament to the enduring power of family, of forgiveness, and of the incredible, sometimes unbelievable twists of fate. The story of Arthur and Beatrice, the siblings who met in a nursing home and realized they were family, became a legend whispered among the residents and staff of Maplewood. It was a reminder that even in the twilight of life, unexpected miracles can unfold, and that the threads of our past, however tangled, can always be rewoven into a tapestry of connection and healing. And so, as we close this chapter, we are left with a powerful truth, that life's most profound narratives often unfold in the quietest of places, among the most unassuming of people. It reminds us to cherish the bonds we have, to forgive ourselves and others, and to always be open to the astonishing possibilities that life, in its infinite wisdom, holds for us. If this story has touched your heart, if it has made you pause and reflect on your own connections, then we encourage you to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of human resilience and the mysteries of fate, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the extraordinary tapestry of human experience. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey.